Okay, first thing we're going to do is import our object. I'm bringing in the oval building. Get into a position where I can actually see it. Now before we get into texturing, we're going to look at scaling. Scaling is the single most important thing to get right in View. What I'm going to do is create a cube, get it into my viewport so I can see it, and I'm just going to change the dimensions of that cube to 1 meter by 1 meter by 2 meters high. So it's really roughly the size of a person. Just drop that onto the ground. And I can see there that my building is going to be really massive. This is meant to be kind of an entrance foyer area, and it's just going to be too big. So I'm just going to manually scale that down. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with the scaling of the object. First thing I'm going to do is just have a look at it in the render. And you can see we've got a fairly vanilla looking grey building. So I'm going to stick on it a texture that I created specifically for my Wastelander buildings, and then I'm just going to have a quick look at that to see how it compares. Okay, much more interesting. You can see the difference. Okay, so let's look how to make your own procedural texture. First thing I'm going to do is just create a very simple cube to work on. So I've just got a plain white cube. I'm going to go and edit the material. And this first material, I'm just double clicking here, and I'm going to load a standard material, anything you like as a backdrop really. I'm just going to look at the rocks and choose, it's kind of arbitrary at this point, I'll choose this rock number 3. And now let's have a look at that in the render. Okay, so it's interesting, but it's not what we're looking for. So that'll do for a base. I mean, you would spend more time, you can see I've done here on this one, I've spent more time tweaking the materials. I'm not going to look at that now. What I'm going to look at is creating your own two-tone procedural mixed material. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to edit this material, and I'm going to change it from a simple material to a mixed material. That gives us 2 slots here. And I'm going to, in this case, double click this material, and I'm going to change it from procedural to mapped picture. I'm going to select down here, I'm going to load a material, I'm going to load a bitmap, and here's a seamless texture that I created specifically for the Wastelander. So I'm going to open that, just click here to preview it. Okay, so you can see now we're mixing material 1, material 2, we're mixing this rock and this grass. So I'll quick look at the preview render. So again, you can see it's starting to mix the materials, but it's not mixing them in the way that we want them to. What I'm going to do is change the way that those 2 materials are mixed, and I'm going to use a fractal using this distribution of materials 1 and 2 here. So I'm going to double click that. You could use any of these, it's worth experimenting with them, but I'm going to use the grainy fractal. And you can see already that's made a huge difference to preview now. So I'm just going to check in my actual render. So it's starting to work. There's not enough of the green, there's too much of the rock, but we're starting to get somewhere now. Let's close that down. I'm going to actually increase the amount of material 2. Let's have a quick look at that. More like it, still need a bit more, so I'm just going to add a little bit more material 2. And let's have a look. What I actually want is the moss to be growing on the bottom predominantly and then kind of petering out as it gets towards the top. So we've got a thicker growth down at the bottom here, and it kind of becomes more little patches as it grows up the building. So I'm going to use the influence of the environment. Clicking on this tab here, I'm going to check this button here, which allows me to use the influence of environment. And now the default is to have the second material growing on top of the object. We actually want it to be the other way around, so we want material 2. So again, remember we're dealing with material 1 here, which is our rock, material 2, which is our moss. We want material 2 to appear at lower altitudes as if it's growing up the building. A quick preview, it won't be right yet, but let's have a quick preview to see how it's working. And it's not bad actually. So what I can now see, because I've got a thicker amount of moss here, is this kind of step and repeat pattern that's happening here. Now that's because the scaling of my bitmap is wrong. It's the same bitmap repeated over and over and over and over. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to keep the rock texture the same size. Normally I would tweak it, but just for this exercise I'm going to keep it the same size, but I'm going to adjust the scale of just the moss. So I'm going to go back to my materials. In the scale of materials here, I see I'm going to change that to, I'm actually going to go as high as 20 just as a test and see how that works. And now that's much better. You can start to see the richness of the textures and the different mottled colours. It's not repeating the same image over and over again. What I do want is a little bit more of the moss to be appearing on the higher altitudes here, so I'm just going to adjust. There's 2 settings you can adjust. One is the influence of the environment, so I'm going to just knock down the influence a little bit just so that it's not constrained to lower altitudes, and then I'm going to add a little bit more of material 2, a bit more of the moss. Now I've probably overdone it because it's tiny little tweaks that make the difference. And it's slightly better, you can see there's a bit more there. So that's it really. What you need to do is just experiment with these 2 settings. Once you've set up your 2 materials, your background material and your kind of growth material, it's a case of just tweaking the amounts of the materials that you want to mix and the influence here of how strong the influence is. And it's just a case of tweaking and faffing with it at this point just to get it how you want it.